Good morning, everybody. Hope you guys had a good weekend. We are here in our last week before spring break. It's a short week. But yeah, so we're going to get into it today. First off, I want to thank everyone once again for sending in the photos. Today, we are going to review some photos that we had. Some of them are from sports day that I got late, and then some of them are the family photos. So let's go ahead and get into those photos and submissions. All right, so one of the late submissions was from Destiny, wearing her Kobe Bryant jersey. Always a good jersey. Thank you, Destiny. And the next photo was sent in by Wendy. Thank you, Wendy, for including your teammates. We have the girls basketball team: Wendy, Kaylin, Martha, and Camila. Good job, ladies. Now we're gonna jump into the submissions for Family Day. First up, we have Destiny and her family, and it's Halloween with Destiny. Thank you, Destiny. Next, we have Juan and his sisters and mother. Next, we have Jesus and his brother Carlos and his mom. Funny story is I asked Jesus whose birthday it was, and he says he had no idea. They're just having cake. Next up, we have Andrea and her family. Thank you for making the collage, Andrea. Next, we have Emily and her family. When Emily was a baby, can you tell which one Emily is? And we also have this picture submitted by Emily, a more recent photo of her and her family at Disneyland. Thank you, Emily. By the way, that is one of my favorite rides right there, the Toy Story Mania ride. I love that ride. And last but not least, we have Carolyn. Thank you, Carolyn. It's crazy how in all your photos that you submitted this week, you've never showed your face. That's pretty funny. Thank you, Carolyn, for submitting this photo. Once again, thank you all for sending in those photos. I really appreciate all you guys sending in those photos all week long, so thank you for that. We'll get back into the stories and the news starting tomorrow. But today, let's go ahead and get into our lessons. Alright, good morning, guys. So I know on Friday I told you guys today we're probably going to do a project on the Renaissance, but I'm going to push that back because I realized that we are going on spring break and we only have 2 more sections left, and I want to be able to give you a test before spring break so you don't forget it all over spring break, and then we'll go ahead and do the Renaissance project when we come back. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and start another section today, and we'll get through that, and on Wednesday we'll take a test. So last time we talked about how we started to talk about the new spreads of ideas of the paper and printing, and how paper making was able to, or when they started to spread the Renaissance ideas beyond Italy, paper was a huge influence because now they can print things and they can pass things out. We also started talking about how they created this guy named Gutenberg, how he created the printing press, and now they were able to print out mass copies of these books and help spread the ideas this way. We also talked about how women, they really couldn't be educated or anything like that, but the way they did spread the ideas of the Renaissance was getting married to these nobles and then spreading this information through the nobles to their husbands. We also started talking about the universities that were built and how a lot of these universities were built, and a lot of these Italian scholars were going to Italy to study, and then when they would go back to their hometowns and they would create these universities, and in these universities they would go ahead and teach the humanities, or they would teach history. Okay, so that's what we talked about last time. So let's go ahead and get into our review for today. So number 1, how did travel and marriage spread Renaissance ideas? People that who traveled to Italy, they took all these Renaissance ideas back home with them, and they took them back to their hometown. So that's how ideas were able to spread during travel. Through marriage, women who married these nobles, they would spread their ideas to their husbands, and when they would take them back to their homelands, that's how that would work. Number 2, how did Johann Gutenberg's machine work? So pretty much his printing press was almost like a huge stamp, and they would have all these little letters. They would put them into a frame, depending on how he would use it. Then he would put ink on these letters, and then he would press it on the paper like a big machine. That's how or like a big stamp. That's how his printing press worked. Number 2, what were 2 advantages over that paper had over animal skins? 2 advantages was paper was easier to make. It was cheaper to make. So easier and cheaper, and also it was easier to transport. So now people can just pass along books of pieces of paper. They don't have to pass around animal skin. So it's cheaper, easier to use, and just easier to handle. Okay? So today we are going to talk about the Renaissance in northern parts of Europe and how it differed from the Italian Renaissance. So today, where our objective is going to be is we're going to be able to explain how the ideas of the Northern Renaissance differed from the ideas of the Italian Renaissance. Okay, here we go. So in the north, it was completely different than the Italian Renaissance. Some of it was the same, such as like their artwork, but a lot of those things were a little different. So as the humanism started to spread, scholars in Northern Europe became more interested in history. So Northern scholars, however, they were not focused on the Greek and Roman history. They were more focused on the history of Christianity. So remember, in Italy, they're in love with bringing back the art forms of Greece and in Rome, but in the north they weren't really caring. They didn't really care about that. All they cared about was Christianity, and they wanted to know the history of the church. So, in the result, they started to combine the humanistic ideas and religious ideas, and they came up with this huge new idea. It was called the Christian humanism. And what they did was many of these northern scholars that thought that the church was corrupt and no longer true to the spirit of Jesus' teachings anymore, and they wanted to have a reform, or they wanted to recall the church and redo the church and have the church come back to their ideas and realize that we need to focus on God and not just on what we have been doing. So this started a whole new type of Renaissance where it wasn't the bringing back of art of the Romans and the Greeks. It was more bringing back the great ideas of God and of the church. So there was this Dutch priest. His name was Diogerius Erasmus, and he was most important of these scholars, and he was fighting for the church. Okay, so in 1509 he published a book. It was called The Praise of Folly, in which he criticized the corrupt clergy. So he was talking bad about the clergy and how they were so corrupt, and all they wanted was wealth and money, and how they weren't really using their ideas to promote the church anymore. They're using it for their own personal gain. So he was writing in this book that he wanted to get rich. He wanted to get rid of some of the church rituals because he thought they were meaningless, and he thought that people were just doing these rituals just to do it, and they lost sight or focus of what they were really supposed to be doing. He also said that we need to devote our lives to God, and we need to devote ourselves to the teachings of Jesus and not get caught up with the wealth and the money that everybody else is talking about, or what the clergy was doing right now. Remember, they're all about making money and spreading this money through their cities, and this is not what church or God was intended for. So he thought we got to bring it all the way back and fix the church so that we can get back to what we're really focused on, which is God. Some of these Northern Renaissance people, they also started to change the way they looked at art. For one thing, the humans painting in the Northern arts, they did not look like the Greeks. They didn't look like the Romans. They decided that we're going to draw people for how they actually looked. We're going to still keep the realism in it, but we're going to draw things realistic, and we're going to show the flaws of people. The reason why they want to show the flaws of people is because they want to show people that they're individuals and they're not perfect, and no one's perfect, and everybody has flaws. And then when we show them in our artwork, it just shows the real beauty of people. Northern artists, they embraced the realism in another way. They also wanted to paint, before they were painting portraits. In Italy, they were painting portraits with personality and stuff like that, with depth. Here in the Northern Renaissance, they did that too, but they also wanted to paint objects, such as like rocks and flowers and other things in the background, trees, houses. They wanted to paint those so realistic that they look like they were real life too on the paper or on their prints or on their paintings. And they didn't want it to be like that. Biblical scenes and classical myths were not really pretty much what the Italian Renaissance art consisted of, but in Northern art, they wanted to really focus on the daily life of people. So they focused on daily life. For example, they would paint people farming, they would paint people hunting for food, they would paint people dancing, they would paint people eating, and they never really painted these biblical scenes or these mythological scenes. If they were painting the church scenes, they were making them realistic and showing what the church should really be about. One of these famous artists, his name was Albrecht Dürer, and he was a famous North artist from Germany. And like the Italian artist, Dürer studied the anatomy so he can paint people with more realistic poses and everything like that. One thing that he did was he decided that he's going to create this thing called a print. And a print is almost like an artwork of a stamp. So it's like that right there. That's one of his most famous stamps or his prints. And what it is he would carve these into wood or into metal, and then he would put paint or ink on it, and then he would stamp it down, and then he would color it in and make details out of it, and then sell his prints. So this is very common nowadays, where people make prints and they can sell multiple paintings of the same art. So that's what a print was. It's like a work of art that was reproduced. So he would use this, cover the image with ink, press it down on paper, and then he would sell those. And a print is pretty much like an art stamp. That's pretty much what it was. So among these other artists, there's other two. His name's like Hans Holbein and Jan van Eyck, and they both grew up in Switzerland, moved to England, but they also painted real life things. They started to paint religious scenes. They would do oil paintings, and they would paint things that were so realistic, but like I said, they were painting more like daily life and stuff like this, and they were not painting biblical scenes or classical myths. So let's go ahead and look at some artwork from North American Renaissance, or the North Renaissance. So these are some photos like you would see in the Northern Renaissance. So people of daily life. So on the left one, you can see the people in the town, just normal life, people going about their business, working, communicating, buying, shopping, trading. That's what you see in the picture on the left. Picture on the right, you see hunters, and you see them with their dogs going out to hunt, and then you see the people cooking over there. But you can see how realistic it looked, like from the trees to the houses to the clouds. This was more of like the Northern Renaissance painting, so not so much of like myths and gods and the biblical scenes, but more of a realistic type of paint. So a quick review, we started talking about the Northern Renaissance and how it changed from the Italian Renaissance. One thing that they did was they weren't focused really on Greece and on Rome. They were more focused on the history of Christianity. And they combined these ideas and they created the Christian humanism movement. And that's kind of what they focused on. They started to think that the church was corrupt and that the church was going away from what was really important, which was following God's will. We had this guy here, his name was Erasmus. He wrote this book criticizing the church and saying that we need to get rid of these meaningless rituals and we need to get back to the devotion of God. We talked about the Northern Renaissance art and how it differed. They still painted things a lot realistically, but they gave a lot more details to other things, and they wanted to show people's flaws because they wanted to show that people aren't perfect and people are individuals. So that was one thing why they showed flaws for this. They would paint daily life, such as like hunting, eating, dancing. One of the things that they're famous for was this guy named Dürer, and Dürer, he created this thing called the prints, and the print was pretty much like an art stamp where he would carve it out of wood or carve it out of metal. He would put ink on it and then stamp it down and then sell his prints, so he can sell more than one copy of his painting. And that was something that was really cool about the Northern Renaissance. So it differed from the Italian Renaissance because they started to include Christianity into it, but they were starting to choose the church history and say why the church was going corrupt and how we should fix it. They also did not paint biblical scenes that much. They also started to paint daily life more. They did a lot of realistic paintings, but they did realistic to show people's flaws, to show everyone who's an individual and everyone's not perfect. Okay. For homework, I want to ask you these 3 questions. Number 1, what is a print? Number 2, how did Christian humanism differ from earlier forms of humanism that developed? So what was different about Christian humanism and the regular humanism? And remember, humanism, if you need to look back in your other notes, it was like the study of history, science, math, and the Greeks and the Romans literature. Number 3, why might painting people to show all their flaws reveal, or why might painting people showing all their flaws reveal about how artists views people? Remember how we talked about people being individuals, so why would they paint people with their flaws? So that concludes our lesson for today. If you guys have any questions, you can always email me, message me, and I can help you out. If not, you always refer back to your notes, refer to the videos, and like I said, tomorrow we will have our last section, and then on Wednesday we'll take a test, and then when we come back from spring break, that's when we'll go ahead and do our little Renaissance project. So I just want to make sure we get this in before spring break so you don't forget. But if you have any questions, let me know. If not, I'll see you guys all tomorrow.